Okay, so I'm reassessing the standard for Chapter 5, and the question at hand is trying to determine if a 1,000-kilogram car traveling at a speed of 14 meters per second around a curve on a road of radius 50 meters will skid or make the curve if the pavement is dry or if the pavement is icy. The coefficient of static friction of dry pavement and of icy pavement is 0.6 and 0.25 respectively. Now consider the free body diagram for the car, with the vertical being the y-axis and the horizontal being the x-axis. Notice that there is no acceleration in the vertical direction, so the normal force of the car is equal to the weight of the car. However, we only have frictional force in the horizontal direction that we have to account for. Thus, this is what we need to determine to answer the question, along with the net force in the horizontal direction to keep the car moving in a circle around the curve. Again, since the net force of the y component is 0, the normal force equals the weight, so Fn equals mg. So solving for Fn and plugging in our values, we obtain that the normal force is 9,800 newtons. Now the net force of the x component is just frictional force. So recall that the frictional force is less than or equal to the coefficient of static friction times the normal force. But we are mainly concerned with the maximum static frictional force. So we solve for the maximum static frictional force by plugging our values for the coefficient of static friction and the normal force on the car obtained above. Thus we get the maximum static frictional force of 5,880 newtons for the dry pavement and 2,450 newtons for the icy pavement. Lastly, we need to compare these maximum static frictional forces to the net force required to keep the car moving in a circle around the curve. And this is found by m times v squared divided by r, which after plugging in those values from the very first page, we get 3,920 newtons. So we really need a maximum static frictional force to at least be this large. So recall that the maximum static frictional force for the dry pavement is 5,880 newtons, and since a force of only 3,920 newtons is needed, that is in fact how much will be exerted by the road has static friction, so the car will be able to make the turn. So on the dry pavement we will be able to make the curve. Now for the icy pavement, recall that the maximum static frictional force is 2,450 newtons. So the car will actually skid because the ground cannot exert a sufficient force, which is 3,920 newtons, which is needed to keep the car moving in a curve of radius 50 meters. So the car will end up skidding because it cannot provide that sufficient amount of force. And that answers both parts of the question. So we know that the dry pavement, the car will be able to make the turn, but on the icy pavement, the car will not be able to make the turn.